Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA. It's great to have your company. I'm your host, David Allen Patali. And I guess tonight, as you can see, is Chris Hammer. This is becoming a bit of a Christmas tradition for us. Of course, in December last year, Chris was our guest, and here he is back again to discuss his new book, The Valley. Now, before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you tonight from the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. Pay my respects to elders, past and present. Of course, Libby Book Club for WA is thanks to the State Library of WA, Overdrive Australia, and of course, Libby. Libby's a fantastic app that you can just download to your smartphone or to your tablet, however you want to get it electronically. And you can get a hold of just about any book you want. And particularly with Libby Book Club for WA, you are first in the queue. So our book for this month is The Valley by Chris Hammer. Chris, welcome to the Libby Book Club for WA, and of course, I have to mention that we're going to give away a signed copy of your book tonight to what I judge to be the best question. So, is there a particular question you don't want to be asked, just so that to make it fair?
No, all questions are welcome. I'm not sure whether I can answer them. Are you going to award yourself the best question?
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. No, I'm not that crooked a judge, to segue in a very obvious way, geez, you write some crooked characters, Chris. It was fabulous to have last December. You hinted when we were talking about the seven that you will, finalizing something, The Valley, which came out. But The Valley is Nell Buchanan and Ivan Lukic. They're back. So this is the latest in their series of adventures and misadventures. Can you tell us about The Valley and where it fits into this continuum with these two fantastic characters?
Okay, I'll give you the setup for the book if you like. So it's pretty much spoiler free, but I understand because this is a book club, a lot of people will have read the book, so we can take it further if you like. So the story begins, it's set in a fairly remote mountain valley, um, and a man is murdered. He's found dead, drowned by a river. Um, a rather divisive character. Ivan and Nell are called in to investigate. So far, so standard police procedure. But in trying to find the killer, the forensic team runs a DNA check on the body to see if they can pick up any sort of extraneous DNA. Of course, they have to test the victim to make sure to rule his DNA out. And what they discover is that he's a very close blood relative of Nell's. And this is quite confronting for Nell because, you see, we learned in the book The Tilt, which came out a couple of years ago, that Nell is adopted. And in that book, The Tilt, she finds out who her mother was, a woman called Amber. She never knew her mother. Her mother died shortly after she was born, but neither she or anyone else knows the identity of her biological father. And this guy, the victim in the river, is a close blood relative of her biological father. And so, for reasons that are explained in the book, Ivan and Nell are prevailed upon to continue with the investigation despite this rather obvious conflict of interest. So, on one hand, Nell is involved in investigating the murder as a professional police officer. She and Ivan trying to find the killer. On the other hand, she's trying to, if you like, investigate her own past, her own origins, her own birth story. As far as she knows, her mother Amber has never been to this place, the Valley. Um, so is it just coincidence that this man has been murdered here? She doesn't know. And so it becomes quite a fraught investigation for Nell as people have read it. What I can tell you now, because it's this more book club with the assumption of people are reading the book, the suggestion for the book, the seed of the book was planted once I'd finished that book, The Tilt. So last year's book was The Seven, and Ivan is the point of character there, and it's a lot to do with his story, but The Tilt was Nell's. And just to explain the interaction between her adoptive family and her biological mother, in the back of the book, there's a family tree. Now,
Okay.
there's a reason it's in the back of the book and not the front. Most of the books all have maps in the front. The reason the family tree was in the back was it's full of spoilers. So by the end of the book, you can check it out and you can see Nell's adoptive family, her biological mother, and her family, and how they're connected. But after the book came out, and people seemed to like it, but a few people came up and said, "Oh, there's a mistake in the family tree." And I thought, "Oh no," because family trees are pretty complicated, but if you're making them up, they're super complicated because you've got to get all the dates so they make sense. You know, you think it's all right, and then you realise, oh no, they can't be the mother of such and such because they would have had to have a baby when they're 8 years old or something like that. So that's what I thought they meant. You know, I've got one of the dates wrong. But what they meant, they said, there's a blank square there. You haven't put down who's Nell's biological father. And I was sort of saying, well, I don't know. You know, she's a fictional character, right? And for that book, The Tilt, it really didn't matter who her biological father was. But that planted the seed, those comments from the, and I was thinking, well, yeah, who is her biological father? Maybe we should find out. And I think that was the seed, the original idea that started me writing The Valley.
And what I really enjoyed how it was coincidental, but truth is stranger than fiction. I mean, thinking back on your career in journalism and report and in wading into human connections, you would often find the most amazing connections between people, and that the deeper that you dug, there would always be something there. Was there something that also in from your career that kind of called back to you or inspired you or gave you some extra heft when you were doing that?
Not so much, I think, in this book. It is informed on some of my, there's some stories, there's some issues in the background here. One is political corruption, which is, you know, kind of prevalent everywhere, but I reported on that. One thing that does emerge in this book, so I explained before how Nell arrives, she and Ivan arrive in the valley to investigate this murder. That's the kind of contemporary story, the present day story. There's two other stories that are set back, one starting in 1990, a young bloke, a police officer called Simmons Burnside, and the other one starting in 1994 is Nell's mother. It's Amber, but she's a young, very young woman at this stage, and she does come to the valley. So that's a sort of spoiler I wouldn't normally give away, but we're making the assumption here that people have read the book. If you haven't read the book, that's revealed very early in the book, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But Simmons gets called back to the valley. He grew up there. He's a police officer to help police forestry wars. There's loggers logging a state forest on the edge of a national park, and there's protesters trying to stop them. Now, as a young reporter, or maybe not such a young reporter, but in the 1990s, I reported on what were called the forestry wars in southeast New South Wales. In fact, at one point, me and my camera crew almost got lynched by angry loggers who I was working for SBS, but they mistook us for another network, and who'd done a hatchet job on them, and they were really angry at us. So yeah, I guess that part of my experience definitely comes into the telling of this story.
Can you tell us about the valley? There's a great sense of at the start, going down that road with all of its different twists and turns, and then all the way down into the valley. You're becoming submerged physically. What's the valley like, and also what did it allow you as an author to do to play with that atmosphere?
So it's based loosely on a real place called the Araluen Valley. Now, that's not many people know about Araluen Valley, certainly not in Western Australia, but many people in New South Wales wouldn't know about it either because it's not on the way to anywhere. It's in the mountains southeast of Canberra, between Canberra and the coast. You go south from a town called Braidwood, and it drops about 600 metres. And this valley, it's quite a bucolic spot. It's has its own kind of microclimate. So whereas on the top of the plateau it gets very cold in winter, sub-zero, down in this microclimate they're growing stone fruit and citrus and grapes and whatever. Now, nothing else about the valley is really based on the Araluen Valley. In fact, it's more dramatic. It looks a bit more like the Blue Mountains or Kangaroo Valley, if people are familiar with sheer sandstone cliffs. But it's a rather lush place, beautiful, but it's fallen on hard times. Back in the day, it was quite prosperous thanks to two industries. One was the logging. There was a sawmill in the valley, and the other was gold. There were gold mines there. And the real Araluen Valley and some of the towns around it were opened up by gold. And so the gold mine plays a very important part in the book. But by the time that Ivan and Elle get there, it's closed. So yeah, so that's the kind of dynamics, the setting. Now, in the book, as in all my books, you get a very clear idea of that about from the map in the front of the book. So
Yeah.
all my books have these maps, right? I'm not sure how clear that is.
Yeah.
And the reason I'm showing you that is if you get the audiobook, if you borrow the audiobook from the library, you won't get the map. So if you want to see the map, just Google my name. I've got a website. All the maps there are there from all the books, and you can click on them and download them. Even if you want a larger copy of the map and you've got a book. So that's just something. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Now, can we start maybe at the beginning, because it's the valley starts with a gold heist, a pretty brutal shootout. So can you tell us a bit about why the book beginning there and then cutting to the present day where there's a murder? What's the
Yeah, so it's a kind of hook to get the reader in. I typically kind of write the books in the order that you're reading them. But I wrote the prologue very late in the piece, maybe after I'd finished the first draft. And the prologue is set in 1988. So you've got the present day story and you've got these other stories set in the valley, Simmons starting in 1990 and Amber in 1994. So this predates everything else. And it's this robbery in a warehouse in Sydney that goes wrong. The thieves take a lot of gold bullion and a lot of money, but there's a shootout. Some of them die. And then if the people who read the book will understand, more of them die in another shootout. And it's not until really the second half of the book that you start drawing connections between that robbery and what's unfolding in the valley.
And when when Ivan and Nell are called, there's always that suspicion that why are we being called out here? Why are we being sent to this remote valley? They've got their hackles up. They've got their suspicions up that something political is in the air, something untoward is in the air. Why are they sent to the valley? Why are those two in particular, and not just the local cops or the Queen Bee and detectives trusted to take care
Okay,
of
this answer's full of spoilers, so if you haven't read the book, block your
I'm,
ears
I'm setting you up, Chris.
because this emerges quite
Yeah.
late in the book. So Ivan and Nell have been based in Dubbo, which is the dead centre of New South Wales, essentially, a big town in the centre of New South Wales. And they become this homicide flying squad that goes and investigates the more difficult cases around New South Wales. And this is actually what happens in New South Wales and probably in other states too, is if there's a murder in a far, a remote area, local detectives investigate it. And the sad truth is most murders are just stupid and violent and there's no mystery at all. It's a domestic violence situation that's just gone too far. and the murderer's sitting there, weeping. There's no mystery, so you don't need anything beyond your normal detectives. So Ivan and Nell, their job is to investigate the more difficult cases, the ones where the local detectives just aren't equipped to deal with it. So with this one, they're immediately suspicious because they're called in straight away. They're called in pretty much the day the body has been discovered. So it hasn't got to the stage where, the local detectives have gone, oh, we're out of our depth, we need help, anything like that. So right from the start, Ivan and Nell are a bit suspicious. Why so quick? Then they suspect it's to do with politics because the guy who's been murdered is a bit of an entrepreneur, wants to bring hydroelectricity to the valley, has brought internet to the valley, but he's a property developer. He's been buying land and subdividing, and some people think that he's great because he's trying to boost this moribund economy. Other people are dead against him because they reckon he's spoiling paradise. And then it emerges that he's had a run-in with the local member of parliament, state member of parliament, and so that's what they start suspecting. And then later on, as they're investigating crimes that happened back in the 90s, this is back in the era of Simmons and Amber. The two policemen did come to the valley to investigate murders, but were called off. And those two policemen were Maurice Montefiore, who is Ivan's old boss from the Martin Scarson books, and a guy called Derek Pakenham, who's Plotter Pakenham, who's now the head of homicide. So those two cops, very senior now, but this was 30 years ago, they'd been sent and they'd basically been called off. And that's part of the reason why Plotter Pakenham has decided, no, enough's enough, we need to investigate this murder properly.
Chris, can you tell us a bit more about the murder victim, Wolfgang?
So Wolfgang, again, he's grown up in the valley, so you get to see him in the 1994 timeline, but he's like a little kid. He's like 3 years old or something. So he's grown up in quite a poor family, but he's made something of himself, and he's become this entrepreneur who is trying to change the valley for the better, at least in his eyes. So he's trying to develop an ecotourism resort. He's trying to bring renewable energy, wind power, solar power, and pumped hydro.
Pumped hydro.
Yeah. So, and to get the pumped hydro working, he just thinks it might be viable to use the old mine, which is up on the top of the cliffs, and it has a lake. And he's thinking maybe we could feed the water down, generate hydroelectricity, and pump it up. And we only find this out, and we find out fairly early in the book, in exploring this, using the old mine and the lake up on the cliff for his hydro plant, he finds some gold. And what Ivan and Nell's great forensic team discover is, even though it looks like a gold nugget, the gold in it is too pure to be a natural gold nugget. And, thereby hangs a story, as it were.
It's secrets within secrets within secrets.
Yes, and the lake and the land on top of the escarpment were once owned by Amber, which is something else we find out during the book.
Well, Chris, we've got a couple of questions from our audience. So, Jordana is asking, many of your books have been set in regional places. Why do you think regional towns work so well for crime novels? I suppose to jump on that, is it because there's more room for secrets
Look, I,
or less?
I can think of a lot of logical answers to this, but for me, I'm not sure there's a more compelling reason than this that they're atmospheric or they're good for crime plots because typically in my books there's more than one crime. And so if you have more than one crime in a small town where everybody knows each other and everybody knows each other's business, links between the two crimes or three crimes or however many crimes it doesn't seem like an outrageous coincidence because it's a small population, a small town, and there's a good memory of things that have happened in the past, but that doesn't fully explain it. I was a journalist for 30 years and I was in and out of the Canberra Press Gallery. I first worked there in full time in the old Parliament House in 1987. Most recently worked there in 2017. So it's a 30-year span. People say, well, why don't you write a political thriller? You know that world so well, which is true. I just don't find it that thrilling, I guess.
Yeah.
I also spent a long time as a roving foreign correspondent, so I reported from places like Moscow and Beijing and, Israel, the Gaza Strip, Cambodia, wherever. So people say, why don't you write a spy book, an espionage book? And once again, I'm equipped to do that from my background. I just don't find those stories as compelling as a good, immersive mystery set in a small Australian country town. I'm not sure, I've always loved the bush. That's about as close I think as I can get to explaining it.
And are you, as a writer, you're more interested in characters? That it's the characters, it's the secrets one set of characters know. Like say, Plotter knows a whole bunch of stuff, and Ivan and Nell are trying to get that information out of him in the beginning, just on text message, like what the hell's going on. But then
Um,
as they find out more, yeah, those layers between people, and so the
so,
event on the side.
so when I first started trying to write a crime book, the one that ended up being called Scrublands, I'd never written a crime book before. I didn't know how to do it. And I was taught that the plot was the be all and end all of a good crime book. Um, and I no longer think that. I think the plot's really important. You want to have the best possible plot with the most mysteries and some good twists and all that for sure. But I think character is at least important, probably more important, because that's what the reader is identifying with, that you're living the story through these people's eyes. And in my books, this last book, as in the previous couple, there's 3 points of view, so 3 people you're following. The setting for me is really important, as I alluded to, that kind of country town setting. It's something I have right from the start when I'm writing a book, what the setting is. And I think it's because that's kind of like the stage where we meet the actors and where the plot plays out. And so between that and the language and the pacing, with my books, I think it's important the kind of emotional stakes for the characters. So in this book, it's Nell who's got really high emotional stakes because she's trying to find out what happened to her mother, who's her father, how she came to be abandoned, all of that. So there's this real emotional content. So I think now what I'm trying to do is kind of cast a spell, and all those things, if they're all working together, it's like, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. I love reading immersive books, the ones where I lose myself in. It takes me away from, day-to-day life and I into this world. I think that's the sort of book I'm trying to write, because that's the sort of book I like to read. So yeah, it's crime fiction, but there's room for a lot more in it than just a simple mystery. I think the character developments and the emotional stakes and their emotional journeys is really important.
I've got to say, like I was when Nell finds out the identity of the murder victim, who Wolfgang truly is,
Yeah,
the reveal of who that was. I found the moments before where Ivan went off and was talking on the phone and wouldn't look at her and wouldn't
yeah,
tell her and wouldn't communicate with her what was going on. That was almost more devastating because of their closeness, that
yeah.
they share secrets and they share intimacy. And all of a sudden he's off not engaging with her, and then he comes back and of course reveals something quite devastating to her. Those little moments between the two of them, they've got such a connection, but that makes it all the more powerful.
This is one of the great joys and fun of writing a book, because that scene, that's never happened, right? I'm not reporting on a real life event. These aren't real people. So I'm imagining it. Oh, she's gonna find out that she's related to this murder guy, the victim Wolfgang. Then how will that scene work? How will it be Plotter will ring up and tell her, right? But and then I thought, well, no, as you say, it makes it more telling if and it's how I think it would play out. Ivan is the senior partner, he's the sergeant. Nell's promoted, but she's still only a senior constable. Plotter would be worried about how Nell would react. So he thinks it's better for her to be told in person. So yes, he would ring Ivan, and that's how it would play out. So I'm trying to imagine, sort of bring it to life, if you like, by imagining something that will have a kind of sense of authenticity about it, I guess.
Chris, would you share some of your writing with us? I think we've picked out an extract from when the book shifts in time, but also perspective. It's the first time we see it. Well, not
Yeah.
apart from the prologue, the first time we see the story from another character's point.
Okay, so David just asked me to read this from page 50, so
Yeah.
let's see how it goes. It's been a long time since I've read it.
Yeah.
But it starts, chapter 4, 1990, and that's written at the top of the chapter. So you as the reader know we've just gone back in time, and this is new. By the time we arrived from Saltwood and reached the forest at the far end of the valley, we knew it was going to be bad. We'd already passed one ambulance. The valley itself felt as peaceful as always, cows on the grass and fruit on the trees, but the forest was a different story. Leaving the pastures and running past the sign reading Tubara State Forest, the scene could have been something from the western front, the valley road becoming a quagmire churned up by logging trucks. The council couldn't see any point in grading it, and the loggers didn't care. It followed the broken river from the valley and into the woods. Before the logging intensified, you could get all the way through to the coast, even in a two-wheel drive, provided it wasn't raining heavily. Now I was glad we were in the big four-wheel drive as we churned through the slurry. Even then, the wheels were sliding this way and that, and I was constantly forced to correct and correct again. Sure this is the right way, Simmons? Asked the Sarge. He knew I'd grown up in the valley. It was probably the reason he brought me with him. He wasn't long in Saltwood, a recent transfer from Sydney. His name was Cornell Obswith, but he hated it, especially his first name, so everyone just called him Sarge, or the Sarge. There's no other way, we won't be much further. Another half a kilometre into the forest, and we came across a logging truck, stopped in the middle of the road, with barely enough room for us to edge up alongside. The truck had a full load on, the logs in the back splattered with orange paint. The driver was leaning against the door, smoking a rollie, the name of the local sawmill on the truck, Cathcarts. I pulled up and we got out, stepping tentatively through the mud. How's that? You might leave it there.
This scene's great because when I first read it, I was like, oh, I didn't know that uh, they splattered logs with orange paint. That must be
Yeah.
some sort of logging thing. And then it just, oh wait, hang on. No, this is a pretty serious incident. This is the logging wars.
This is
Um,
the protesters trying to devalue the logs.
is there a sense that in when you go to the bush that people just think this is bucolic, everyone gets along? It's like going back to the 1950s where, you know, white picket fences and everything's absolutely fine. But we underestimate how much conflict there can be in regional areas, how many plates shift against each other.
No, I don't think people, if they once had that view of the bush of being kind of bucolic, and you get it in those kind of midsummer murder type
Yeah.
mysteries. But I think contemporary Australian crime writing, like my books, or Hayley Scrivener, or Jane Harper, or Sarah Bailey, whatever, it's not a bucolic place. It's under pressure. In this book, it's economic pressure, but often it's climate change, which makes the bush less certain. You know, in my first book, Scrublands, it's drought. It's an irrigation town with no water. There's bushfires. In this book, there's a flood, a dramatic flood. Simmons almost gets killed in a flash flood. So no, it's the bush is unpredictable and potentially dangerous. And I think that's the way I'm writing the bush. It doesn't mean you can't. Someone else won't write a wonderful midsummer murders type bucolic type bushland, but it is crime fiction, so bad things will happen.
There's to go. I like that, Chris. um, got some really good questions here in the chat, so I'll just pick one out. So, you mentioned earlier that each of your novels has a map in front of it. How important is the geographical mapping process to your planning of the plot? So I was wondering that too. Does the map? Do you ever sketch? Do you sketch it out on the back of a napkin, or and then give that over to the artist, or
Now, I am equipped with paper.
yeah,
So it started almost by accident when I was writing Scrublands. And the Scrublands are set in a kind of a real landscape, but the town is fictional. So I started drawing a map, not intending to put it in a book, but just for my own reference. So, you know, in chapter 3 or something, when I'm describing the town and I'd say the bank is next to the post office. And, you know, I was writing that book in my spare time, so it could be weeks could pass before I get a chance to write again. I might forget that. And in chapter 5, I put the bank across the road from the post office. And then in chapter 23, they're 2 blocks away. So I started drawing the map purely for my own reference, so the logic of the book would not get upset, that some reader would find, oh, hang on, wasn't the post office over there, that sort of thing. And crime writers are going to do this with other elements, such as a timeline. Who's where, when? You know, has the murder got enough time to be seen here, go off and kill someone, be seen somewhere else, go and dispose of the body, get seen, change their clothes, you know, all that sort of thing. Doesn't go in the narrative, but it's just information in the background. So that's how it started, and it was only a last minute decision when I submitted the manuscript for Scrublands to an agent that I thought, oh, I'll put the map in the front. And the reason I did is because I thought, oh, maybe I haven't described the town well enough. In retrospect, I don't think it was a problem, but we liked the map. The publisher then liked the map, not the very ordinary, poorly sketched map that I had done, but one done by a proper artist, Alexander Potocznik, who's done all the maps. And now it's become a bit of a feature of the books. But the map evolves with the writing of the book. Occasionally, like my book, Trust was set in Sydney.
Yeah.
So that's a real location, and the artist found that very simple because you could look at Google Maps. My book, The Tilt, is based on a real place, the Barmah Forest on the Murray River. I fictionalised the names of the town, but the landscape is true to life. And again, he found that easy. But in other places, it's constantly changing. So, for example, in my second book, The Silver, the plot needed some characters to be out of telephone range. So, I'll have a little ridge and a secluded beach behind the ridge, so the telephone signal won't. So I changed the map to reflect that. So yeah, the maps, they take a lot of work between Alex and me, backwards and forwards, getting it just right. Yeah.
Well, the maps are, I guess, the physicality of the story, but it's the people as well. You like you were saying before, it's the characters and the interplay. What was it like to go back to Nell? You with Ivan, we had the seven where we that was his story, but to come back to Nell and give her story. What tell us about Nell as a character, but also like what was it like to connect with her again and to
So Nell is in the last book, the seven. But because there's three different timelines in that book, there's a present day, there's a timeline and a story set in the 1990s, and a story told way back, starting in 1913 through the eyes of a domestic servant. I don't want to have two points of view in the present day to get too messy. So Nell was the point of view character in The Tilt, Ivan in the seven, and now coming back to Nell. These characters started as very small ideas in a sense. I'd written three books in the Martin Scarston Mandalay Blonde series where they had a lot of emotional, uh, uh, they had high emotional stakes. I didn't know where else to take them. So I had this idea for a book. I didn't think you could use journalists again. I used these policemen, Ivan and Nell. And Ivan had been a rather minor character in the Martin books. Nell's a new character. And I had the idea of just throwing these two people together who'd never met in really difficult circumstances, these two police officers. And that's the book Treasure and Dirt. And the idea was, in that book, both of them, for different reasons, their careers are under threat. And so the question is, will they work together to catch the killer and thereby, save their careers? Or will they sort of throw the other person under the bus, as it were? And there's good reason to do that in the book. So my intention was just to write that book as a standalone and then go back to Martin and Mandy. But they kind of grew on me. And I went, well, what is Nell's story? So in that first book, Treasure and Dirt, there's no mention at all that Nell is adopted because, as again, it's a fictional character, not a real person. I didn't know that about her when I wrote Treasure and Dirt. Then I was writing The Tilt. They go and they go to investigate a murder in this forest, but then more bodies are discovered, and Nell begins to suspect that members of her own family are implicated in these murders because it's the area close by where she grew up. So you can again see kind of high emotional stakes for Nell. It's just not a professional police, arm's length homicide investigation. So they've grown over time, and you learn more about Ivan and his past in the seven. Nell's very much in the seven. She's not a point of view character. She plays some really important roles in that book and that story. So you do learn more about her there. But then this one, as I said, there was this idea, this seed of an idea planted. Who is her father? And her mother, who's almost a peripheral character in The Tilt, comes alive in this book. There's another person in this book that some of the people who've read my books in the past, starting in Scrublands, the journalist Martin Scarsden, his great champion, his great mentor is this guy called Max Fuller, who in Scrublands, by the time Scrublands comes around, Max is the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. And then he plays an important role in Silver and Trust. So in this book, I thought I need a journalist. And it can't be Martin, because Martin in
Yes.
early 1990s would be about 10 years old. So it's not him. I thought, oh, I'll bring back Max.
Yeah.
And Max in the Martin books is the editor. He's an old wise head. He knows everything there is to know about journalism. Here we see him as a young reporter making
Yeah.
mistakes
Yeah.
and learning from his mistakes. So that was another opportunity to flesh out a pre-existing character.
Can you maybe just explore with us the interplay between police and journalists? In that police are looking to crack the case, journalists are looking for the scoop, but they're both hunting, aren't they?
That's true, and at times they can cooperate. So I know when the Martin books
Yeah.
came out, and he's solving crimes, if you like, and people go, well, that wouldn't happen. That journalist wouldn't do that. That's the police's job. Seriously, some of the biggest crime stories in Australia, royal commissions, institutional child abuse, the Banking Royal Commission, war crimes in Afghanistan, they've all come out of investigation. Hedley Thomas, his podcast, The Teacher's Pet, that guy got convicted of murder. So journalists do investigate things. Now, the thing is, in the real world, police talk to journalists, and they do it for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes they just want help. Other times they might be frustrated by a situation, so they leak information to a journalist. There's all sorts of reasons. But journalists and police definitely do interact. Some police hate journalists. Some police see a use for journalists. Journalists definitely need sources for stories. Now, whether that's a police officer or a politician, I was never a crime reporter, by the way. I was never a police reporter, but I was a political journalist. And I know that politicians talk to journalists all the time for all sorts of reasons, but they would deny in public that they do it. It's part of the way the world works.
Is Max fun to write in the sense
They're
that
all fun to write, and it's a question. Sometimes, if I'm doing your job, David, I'm interviewing another author,
Okay.
and I say, if you're writing something and something funny happens, and you're writing it, your head's in that space writing that. Well, do you laugh? Do you ever laugh out loud? And most of them go, yeah, at times. And I say, do you ever shed a tear? You're in one of those poignant moments or a sad moment. It's a made-up story, they're fictional characters, but do you ever shed a tear? And about half the authors will go, yes, yeah, I do. How could you possibly know that? And the other half go, what? Are you mad? But I'm one of the ones who will shed a tear or have a laugh. Yeah. So I really get involved in the stories.
I'll go to some questions now. We've got a
So you
great one.
you can keep that question for your next author.
Oh, no, it's a good one. That's good. So Peter Snow is asking, this kind of relates actually. If your setting is real, well, we were talking about Araloo and Valley earlier, then many of your characters, are they actually based on real people you've encountered in your travels, and to what extent have you embellished them, or have you just taken the rib and given life?
Yeah, I'm not. I don't base my characters on real people. Some authors do. Some authors really mine their friends and families, to the point that their friends and families greet each new book with some trepidation. I don't. Martin is kind of based on some of the really traumatized war correspondents I ran into, reporting overseas. I wasn't like a frontline correspondent, but occasionally I did report from dangerous places. So I met these characters who were kind of addicted to the action, but they weren't post-traumatic, they were just traumatized. Um, so sometimes I think it's an amalgam of people. Often they just start as a plot point. Martin or Mandy or Ivan or Nell, they need to find out something that's happened in the past before they've arrived on the crime scene. Someone has to tell them. Well, why not make that person interesting to the reader, like intriguing, make them funny or absurd or quirky or sinister or threatening or unusual in some ways. And then sometimes they kind of take on a life of their own. I know in my last book, The Seven, there's a local politician, and he's a big red-faced, blustery guy with a big beer gut, a bit of a windbag, carries on. And for some reason, people thought that was based on Barnaby Joyce, that I was having a sort of crack at Barnaby Joyce. I wasn't. I swear I wasn't.
Oh, he's
It
trimmed
was
down.
just a rural politician that fit a certain sort of mold, I guess. But
That's
no, I
fine.
don't base them on real characters.
No, no. And look, you can argue that some people in real life lean into the stereotype to give them some gravitar or something like that.
Yeah,
You know.
so in the book Treasure and Dirt, the first Ivan and Nell book, there's a kind of a competition, if you like, between these two mining billionaires, and they're really kind of over the top characters. Again, they're not based on any real person, but Australian mining billionaires, I don't
Oh,
have to tell you, people from Western Australia this, can be larger than life people. They're not, they don't seem to me to be shy, retiring types. There probably are some, and we just don't know about it. But everyone from Twiggy Forrest to Gina Reinhardt to, what's his name?
Chris Ellison.
Yeah, no, I was thinking the one from Queensland, Clive Palmer.
Yeah, Palmer. Yeah, yeah.
And
They came up to,
they're all
yeah.
kind of eccentric, right? So good seem to mind. But in that book, definitely those characters aren't based on any of those real life people. Um, I think just it's part of the fun is making them up and watching them grow.
And do you enjoy the names? I love all the names. They're
Yeah.
just cracking names.
The, Again, the names, like the maps, happened pretty much by accident. When I was writing Scrublands, I didn't have great expectations for it. And that was partly because I'd written two non-fiction books that were very well received, particularly the first one, The River. It won prizes and was shortlisted for others. I was invited to a lot of writing festivals, but sold absolutely nothing, right? To the extent I had to give away writing, go back and get a proper job. So when I was writing Scrublands, that was my expectation. By the time I was getting through, I thought, oh, this is pretty good. Someone will publish it. But I didn't think I'd make any money out of it, certainly not make a living out of it. And I think I just got a bit bored and started using these rather eccentric names, sort of Dickensian names like Harley Snouch and Martin Scarsden and Mandalay Blonde, Codger Harris. It was only after the book was published and was, very successful that it occurred to me that I sort of over egged the pudding with the names, and they're, a bit over the top. And
It's in your
I was a
brain.
bit worried about that because you know what I was saying about casting that spell. Well, you don't want anything that's going to break that spell, these outlandish names. But then I was at a book event, I was signing books, and a woman came up, a reader, and said, I love your names. They're very distinctive. And they help me remember who's who because your plots are quite
Yeah.
complicated, which is true. And I thought then, well, I work with some of the best editors in Australia, probably the best editors in Australia. And if they thought it wasn't working or was too disruptive, they would have they would have suggested to me that I wind it back. But they didn't. But then I was a bit stuck with it because there are a lot of recurring characters in my book. Um, so, I could hardly have Martin Scarsden and Mandalay Blonde in subsequent books, but they have all the new characters with these kind of bland Tom, Dick, and Harry names. So I've had to lean into it a bit without trying to be too outlandish. I think peak outlandish name was again Treasure and Dirt, where there's a guy there who owns a earth moving equipment business, and his name's Trevor Topsoil. I think that might be as far as I can get away
Yeah.
with.
That's great. That's great. Thank you, Chris. I've got a question here from Qual, which is I think if we go back to it goes back to Nell and to Ivan. Are you tempted to not use the same two detectives, or is the pull of their story so demanding that they be used again? I mean, you're mentioning you're discovering them as they go on, but you're also leaving yourself, opportunities like who's Nell's father?
Yeah, look, I'm am I tempted to write with new characters? Yeah, I am. But on the other hand, these characters grow on you, and if a new story suggests itself. So, as I said, my intention with Treasure and Dirt was it was going to be a standalone. Then I go back to Martin and Mandy. Maybe I'll go back to Martin and Mandy. Maybe I'll do another book with Ivan and Nell, or maybe I'll get an idea for a standalone book. I quite so my books so far. One thing, in some ways, they're very different and they evolve. And so the first book is told totally from Martin's point of view. This book is told from three different points of view, different timelines, different people. So that's different. But all of my books have got outside protagonists, investigators, if you like, who come into a story. They're the ones that the reader is riding along with, trying to solve the mystery. So in the first three books, it's Martin and to an extent Mandy. And in these last four books, it's Ivan and Nell. But I quite like reading those books where there's not a detective or a police officer or a journalist. It's just the people in the book. And the thing about those books is they tend to be a standalone. Um, or maybe you can do a sequel or a prequel, but typically a standalone. So I think at one point I'm going to get an idea for a story. I'm going to go, you know what, this doesn't need a Martin Scarsden. This doesn't need police officers. This can be a self-contained mystery. So I am absolutely not so much tempted by that idea. I'm attracted to the idea. I just haven't had the idea yet.
Chris, I've got a bit of a kind of a philosophical question for you. Like with Nell and actually with all of your characters who are investigating, whether they be police or journalists, when you're writing, they're always seeking the dignity to bear witness, to bring justice in a very cynical and hard world that
Yeah.
strips the paint off them constantly. When you're writing, what is your North Star for how justice is delivered, or how humanity is viewed, and how is that expressed through your characters?
I I don't really write with that sort of top-down objective point of view. I'm more down in the weeds with the characters. I often don't know how the story's going to end or what the answers to the mysteries are. So as they're kind of investigating it,
Okay.
I'm investigating it too. So, for example, in Scrublands, the prologue is this very dramatic murder where a priest shoots five of his parishioners. And a year later, Martin goes to the town to do an anniversary story, how the town is coping a year on. Then he begins to suspect that the accepted story, as perpetuated not just by the police but his own newspaper, about why the priest had done what he did is wrong, and he starts digging, right? It's good. The thing is, in writing that book, I didn't know why the priest had done it. I was still trying to work it out. And I actually rewrote the ending of that. I was sort of learning on the job, but I rewrote the ending three times and changed things, including why he did it. So when you're saying, well, what's the kind of overview North Star? I'm not sure it's in my mind consciously. Um, there is a kind of contract though that you and unwritten contract between the author and the reader is here are these mysteries. At the start of the book, more mysteries emerge in the telling of the story. by the time we get to the end of the book, you're going to understand all these mysteries. You're going to understand what happened and why. And if I can make that story kind of emotionally worthwhile, I guess, for the reader, for the characters, then I think job well done.
Chris, I saw you in person about, I think it was like 2 months ago. You were here in Perth with Christian
Yeah,
White.
yeah, yeah.
Test interview. It was a great evening. That was you were touring for the Valley. What's it been like in contrast? I hate to bring up COVID, but your career kind of tracks either side of that sort of barren time where we couldn't get out and
Yeah.
about. How are you enjoying actually being out touring around Australia, meeting book clubs, having chats from the length and breadth of the land, and also doing it with one of your mates. You're there with
Um,
Christian.
Look, fantastic. Um, Now, not every writer likes doing it. Some people find it, I mean, the reason they're writers is they're rather reclusive personalities. So getting out and talking on stage and whatever, I don't have a problem with that. I think because all the years as a journalist, particularly as a television journalist, I quite enjoy it. Um, this time around, I toured for 5 weeks, and there was those three events in Perth, which I did with Christian, which is fantastic. I had some writers' events in between. The reason why I came over to WA was there was a writers' festival in Geraldton, and then I came to Perth after that. I did an event at a winery with Benjamin Stevenson, who's a great writer. One of the things I've discovered since becoming a crime fiction author is the crime fiction authors, and you were mentioning some of the ones before that are coming up in book club. It's a really good community. It is incredibly collegiate. It's very supportive, and it's lots of fun. So it's always good to hang out with other crime writers. Yeah.
Chris, we're coming to the end of our time together. I really appreciate you actually. You're coming to us from Canberra. It's 10 o'clock. Nearly 11 o'clock at night for you there
Yeah.
now. So we really appreciate you making time for the Libby Book Club for WA and all of your very generous answers. I'm going to select what I think is the best question because it prompted the best answer. Um,
Okay.
so it was from Peter Snows. If your setting is real, then many of the characters are actually based on real people. Because that gave us a great thread to go down. So, Peter, I'm going to type my Gmail address in here for you. You can send me your address. Um, we'll get that signed copy of this the Valley out to you as soon as we can. So also, I think Julianne, who's listening in, will also try and take your details down too. So we've got time for just one last question, Chris. What do you think is the most significant component of your novels, the crime or the emotive interactions that you weave into the story? I think we answered that one, but I think this is a good way to end it.
Yeah, I think the emotional story is probably more important, but I go back to what I said before about trying to cast a spell so that all those elements, the plot, the characters, the setting in particular, the events that unfold, the pacing of the story, the emotional stakes, if you get them all working together, that it becomes, as I said, the whole becomes greater than the sum of the parts. So I'm not saying the plot doesn't matter or have a lousy plot or something like that. Not at all. But I think the characters, you need the you need the readers to care about the characters. Typically that might be they identify with the characters. And I think Ivan and Nell are the sort of people that you might want to identify with, but particularly Nell. There might be some other characters that are kind of nasty or whatever, but the important thing there is you care about what happens to them. Now that might be that they get their comeuppance, they're thrown in jail, or if they're killers, they're killed in turn or whatever. But you want to care about them, and you want to care about the story, and you want the reader to. I want for the reader to experience what I love myself, and that's getting lost in a good book.
Chris, it's certainly easy to do. You definitely cast a spell over me with the value. I think I read this in about 3 days.
Oh,
So
great. Thank you.
yeah, you work your butt off to create this, and everyone just
Yeah.
in how. But really appreciate your time, Chris. It's great to have you back on the Libby Book Club for WA, and let's do this again next year.
I've just got to write another book,
I know,
but
you're right on. Go
okay.
on.
Okay. Look, thank you so much, David, and thank you for everyone who's listened in.
No worries. Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us. We'll see you in January. Have a Merry Christmas and a very Happy New Year. See you later, everybody.